A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Alright, today's prompt from Daniel is about a harrowing development out of Iran. This week, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officially lowered their minimum recruitment age to 12. It is a stark move, and it serves as a grim entry point into a global trend we need to dissect. We are talking about the systematic militarization of children, the psychological mechanics of how these groups or state actors actually groom 12-year-olds, and whether that kind of ideological conditioning can ever truly be reversed.
I'm Herman Poppleberry, and this is a topic that requires us to look past the immediate moral horror to understand the actual technical pipeline. When we see a headline like Iran recruits 12-year-olds, the instinct is to see it as an act of desperation or a one-off. But if you look at the data from Sudan, Myanmar, or even historical precedents, there is a very specific logic to targeting this age bracket. By the way, today's episode is powered by Gemini 3 Flash Preview, which is helping us synthesize some of the more recent reports coming out of the Middle East and North Africa as of late March 26.
It's interesting you call it a pipeline, Herman, because when most people hear child soldier, they think of a kid being snatched off a street at gunpoint. But recruitment, in the IRGC context, or with the Basij militia, sounds a lot more organized, almost like a dark version of the Scouts.
That is the distinction we need to make. We are talking about the systematic targeting of minors by armed groups where the recruitment is integrated into the very fabric of civil society. In Iran's case, this March 26 policy announcement essentially formalizes what has been happening under the rug for years through the Basij. By lowering the official age to 12, they are essentially saying that the state's security apparatus now officially begins in 7th grade. They aren't just looking for incidental casualties or kids to run messages. They are building a structured entry point for combatant support and homeland defense roles.
12 just feels so young. I mean, at 12 I was mostly worried about whether I could beat a boss level in a video game, not patrolling a checkpoint. Why is 12 the magic number here? Why not 10 or 14?
There is a very specific neurodevelopmental window here, Corn. If you look at the research on the prefrontal cortex, it doesn't actually finish developing until you are 25. But the period between ages 10 and 14 is what psychologists often call the plasticity peak for social and ideological identity. At 12, a child is transitioning from concrete thinking to more abstract reasoning. They are starting to look for an identity outside the family unit, but they lack the cognitive breaks to critically evaluate the long-term consequences of ideological commitment.
So it's a tactical sweet spot. You get someone old enough to carry a rifle or staff a radio, but young enough that their sense of self is still a blank slate that you can write the state's ideology onto.
Precisely. And we see this across the board. Look at Sudan right now. The Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, have been documented throughout 23 and 24 recruiting heavily from secondary schools in Darfur. Their entry age often hovers right around that 12 to 14 mark. In Myanmar, the Tatmadaw has a long-standing child soldier pipeline that targets 14-year-olds. These groups aren't just looking for muscle, they are looking for true believers who haven't yet developed the mental defenses to say no to a charismatic commander or a patriotic narrative.
And the patriotic narrative is the hook, right? In the IRGC case, they frame it as defending the homeland. It's polished, it's high definition, and it's everywhere. We actually touched on this in episode 1523 when we talked about high-def hybrid war and state propaganda networks. When the propaganda is that sophisticated, a 12-year-old doesn't stand a chance. It's not a fair fight between a child's brain and the state-sponsored media machine.
It's really a layered architecture of indoctrination. It starts with what I'd call soft militarization. Think of the Basij centers in Iranian schools. It begins with sports, religious education, and community service. It feels like belonging. Then, once the child is integrated into the social group, the messaging shifts. It moves from love your country to the enemy is subhuman, or martyrdom is the highest calling. By the time they are handed a uniform at 12 or 13, they have already been pre-processed for years.
It's a grooming process, plain and simple. But it's not just Iran. You mentioned Sudan and Myanmar. What are some of the other hotspots where this 12-year-old threshold is being crossed right now?
The scale is actually staggering. The United Nations estimates that as of 24, there are between 120,000 and 150,000 children currently serving in armed groups globally. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, militias like the M23 have been known to recruit as young as 10. In Colombia, even after the FARC agreement, dissident groups are still pulling minors into their ranks because children are cheap to maintain and easier to control than adult mercenaries who might desert for better pay.
That's a cold way to put it. Cheap to maintain. But it's the reality of asymmetric warfare. If you're a militia leader, a 12-year-old is a renewable resource who doesn't ask for a salary and is less likely to question a suicidal order.
It's also about the human sensor aspect we discussed in episode 1316. In modern conflicts, you need people who blend in, who can staff checkpoints without looking like a professional army, or who can act as eyes and ears in a neighborhood. A child is the perfect low-profile operative. They can move through a city or sit at a patrol point without drawing the same scrutiny as a 30-year-old man in fatigues.
Okay, so we've established the why from the recruiter's perspective. It's effective, it's cheap, and it exploits a biological vulnerability. But let's talk about the what happens next. If you spend your formative years from 12 to 18 inside an ideological pressure cooker like the IRGC or a Sudanese militia, what does that do to the wiring of the brain? Is this metabolic bankruptcy territory like we talked about in episode 1375?
It is exactly that, but with a permanent structural twist. When you subject a developing brain to high-stress environments and intense ideological conditioning, you are essentially hard-coding the amygdala for a state of perpetual threat response. But more than that, you are shaping the identity, neurons. If your entire concept of being a man or being a good citizen is tied to a specific militia or a specific ideology before you hit puberty, your brain literally builds itself around that framework. We discussed the biological costs of this in episode 1261, the frozen psyche. When a child is forced into these roles, the developmental energy that should go toward empathy and complex reasoning is diverted into survival and obedience.
So even if the war ends or the kid gets out, the software is still running on the hardware.
That is, the reversibility problem. Can you actually deprogram someone whose personality was forged in a war zone? There was a fascinating longitudinal study on former child soldiers in Sierra Leone after their civil war ended in 2002. They found that while you can physically reintegrate someone, give them a job, put them in school, the psychological echoes last for decades. Many of those former recruits struggled with moral injury, where their actions as children conflicted with their adult sense of ethics, leading to massive rates of depression and social detachment.
I imagine it's even harder when the indoctrination is state-sponsored. In a militia, you might realize later the group was bad. But if the entire state told you at 12 that you were a hero for joining the IRGC, and then the regime changes, or you leave, you're not just losing a job, you're losing your entire worldview.
That is the difference between physical reintegration and psychological deprogramming. Most international programs, the DDR programs, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration focus on the physical stuff. Hand in your gun, here is some vocational training, go back to your village. But they often miss the identity component. If you don't replace the warrior identity with something equally compelling, the brain naturally gravitates back to what it knows. This is why we see high rates of re-recruitment in places like the DRC or Somalia. The militia is the only place they feel competent.
It's like a gig economy of treason, to borrow our phrase from episode 811. If the only skill a 19-year-old has is patrolling a checkpoint for the IRGC, And that's the only place he felt respected. He's going to look for that same hit of dopamine and belonging elsewhere if the state fails him.
And the international community is frankly failing these kids on the legal front too. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court sets 15 as the minimum age for war crimes prosecution. So, if a group recruits a 12-year-old, there is this weird enforcement gap. They are too young to be held responsible, but the people who recruited them often operate in jurisdictions like Iran or Sudan where the ICC has zero leverage. It's a loophole exploited by every commander who realizes that a 13-year-old combatant is a legal ghost.
So what does a successful version of this look like? Have we seen anywhere that actually managed to reverse this kind of indoctrination on a large scale?
The most hopeful data actually comes from Colombia, specifically the programs for youth exiting the FARC. They realized that you can't just treat it like trauma, you have to treat it like a re-education in the positive sense. They focused heavily on cognitive flexibility, training, teaching these kids how to see multiple perspectives, how to handle disagreement without violence, and how to build a self-image that wasn't tied to a uniform. But it takes years. It is a 1-to-1 ratio. For every year of indoctrination, you probably need a year of intensive, high-resource support to undo it.
Which is exactly what a country in the middle of a collapse or a war doesn't have. They have the resources to buy the drones and the rifles, but they don't have the resources to fix the kids once the rifles are taken away.
It's a form of metabolic debt for the entire society. You are borrowing the youth of your population to fight today's battles, but you are creating a bankrupt generation for tomorrow. When Iran lowers the age to 12, they aren't just filling gaps in the Basij, they are ensuring that 20 years from now, their society will be led by people whose brains were shaped by the narrow, violent parameters of the IRGC's current worldview.
It's chilling. It reminds me of that frozen psyche discussion we had in episode 1261. When the psyche is frozen in that state of conflict at age 12, the thaw is incredibly messy. Sometimes it never happens at all.
It's also worth noting how technology is changing the utility of a 12-year-old. We are moving into an era of remote warfare, drones, digital surveillance, cyber operations. You don't need to be a 6-foot-tall bruiser to operate a suicide drone or monitor a telegram channel for dissent. As warfare becomes more asymmetric and digital, the physical limitations of a child matter less. If a 12-year-old can pilot a drone via a tablet, they are just as lethal as a seasoned soldier. That changes the calculus for recruiters. It makes children more valuable in a modern tech-driven conflict.
That is a terrifying thought. The gamification of war combined with the vulnerability of a 12-year-old's brain. We are basically looking at a future where combatant status has nothing to do with physical maturity.
And that is why our actionable takeaways have to focus on the pipeline, not just the aftermath. If you wait until the kid is already in the IRGC or the RSF, you've already lost the most critical battle. Prevention has to happen at the community resilience level.
Right. If the soft recruitment starts in the schools and the religious centers, that's where the intervention has to happen. You have to provide an alternative, belonging, that is more attractive than the militia.
For our listeners who want to actually engage with this, the most effective organizations aren't just anti-war groups, they are the ones focusing on education access and economic stability for families. Because a 12-year-old usually joins a militia for one of 3 reasons. They are forced, they are fed, a hero narrative, or their family is starving and the militia provides a meal. If you take away the economic desperation and provide a competing hero narrative through education or community leadership, the recruitment yield for the IRGC drops significantly.
It's about building mental armor before the indoctrination starts. But man, seeing that March 26th date on those reports from Tehran, it feels like we are watching a slow-motion disaster.
It is a disaster, but understanding the mechanisms is the first step toward breaking them. If we know that age 12 to 14 is the plasticity peak, then that is where the world needs to focus its resources. We can't just throw our hands up and say, it's a tragedy. We have to treat it as a systemic problem with specific intervention points.
Well, on that heavy but necessary note, I think we've covered the why and the how of this shift. It's a dark development, but as always, Daniel's prompt pushed us to look at the wiring beneath the headline.
It's a vital one to keep an eye on. This isn't just an Iranian policy change, it's a bellwether for how state actors are going to exploit human biology in the next decade of conflict. As these conflicts become more asymmetric, the question is whether we will see more states follow this path, or if international pressure can actually close the legal loopholes that make 12-year-olds so attractive to recruiters.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and our research pipeline.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, a quick review on your podcast app really does help us reach more people who are looking for substance over sound bites.
You can find all 1,606 episodes at myweirdprompts.com. We will be back soon.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth for man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.